The United States and people who represent the US these days are not interested in thinking allies. They basically have an open book for sycophants. So the chances of the Americans having a victory over Taiwan is nil, in my opinion. And why would we want to be part of that defeat? We're stuck here as the Americans take off back to their continent across the other side of the Pacific. We live in a Chinese world. They cannot be fielded without the support of the United States. If there's interoperability, it means our sovereignty is just simply swept. Our freedom of movement and sovereignty is simply swept away. And no self-respecting Australian should ever put up their hand for our sovereignty being subjugated in this way. The French had a revolution for their republic. The Americans have a revolution for their republic. We couldn't even pinch ours off Queen Elizabeth II, who didn't want it. We couldn't take the title, even if the monarch was happy to give it. So if Australians have so little pride in themselves, that they're happy to be represented by the monarch of Great Britain, why would somebody like me want to shift their miserable view of themselves? Its head of state is a monarch of another country. Its strategic sovereignty has been outsourced to another state, a North Atlantic state, the United States. It doesn't know what it is or what it should be.
我们刚刚看到的是澳大利亚前总理保罗基廷在一场公共论坛上的片段。这本该是一场关于外交政策的讨论，但他却把它变成了一场对澳大利亚从里到外的无情炮轰。在接下来的内容中，你将听到一场来自澳大利亚政坛元老的最彻底的自我批判。他将系统性的揭示美国究竟想要一个怎样的盟友。一段充满忘恩负义的亲身经历将告诉你一个残酷的答案。耗资千亿的 AUKUS 潜艇协议，为何在他看来是一场对国家主权的公然出卖，而澳大利亚却沾沾自喜？以及这一切战略错误的背后是一种怎样深刻的，甚至连国家元首都是英国君主的民族认同危机？这是一位前领导人对自己国家未来发出的最沉痛的警告。让我们继续。
Can we just move on to the US alliance, actually, the US-Australia alliance, and talk about that in a little bit more detail, and I guess go back to some of that history as well, from when you were in government, but even before when you were in government. I just want to open it by mentioning a quote from a recent interview that I did with the CEO of the US Studies Centre, Michael Green, who mentioned you along with Hugh White and Bob Carr as being those who, he said, quote, openly questioned the alliance, and he said that you were apparently, he said, taking China's case to the Australian people in criticising the United States. And he added, he said, this was not a good look, and it did make people a bit nervous in the Obama administration and at the beginning of the Trump administration. Now, Paul Keating, can I ask what's your response to that kind of appraisal?
Well, the United States and people who represent the US these days are not interested in thinking allies. They basically have an open book for sycophants, not thinking allies. In my own case, I've made a few points here worth thinking about. The US is exceptionally ungrateful for people who have stuck to it through a lifetime. I'm one of them. Right? For 2 decades within the Labor Party, up to 1983-84, I supported the United States, the alliance, against what was then the pro-communist left, the soft pro-com left.
Yeah, so you were taking these
every
people
year.
on.
John Howard would be at Church of England Sunday school bazaars while I was fighting the comms at the town hall. This is the real battle, right? When I went with Bob Hawke, he invited me to meet President Reagan on the first trip. We're on the old 707, and he said, because Bob had been supported by the left all his life, and he wanted to have these qualifications, with the US. And he's talking to me. I said, look, if I were you, Bob, I'd positively embrace President Reagan as a jolly sort of a guy, and your friend George Shultz, in our post-83 relationship, particularly with the problem with the Whitlam government in the 70s, fresh in their mind. the problem that Whitlam had with
Nixon.
And I said, Bob, this is the black and white brigade. They're not interested in greys. Let's embrace them enthusiastically and let's get on with it, right? That's more or less the fight. I'm not saying I was the sole person who was influential on Bob, but it was a big influence on him, right?
But that's when Bob Hawke said, "We are together forever, Australia and the United States."
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, Ronnie was a great host. Let me say that. And then the first policy commitment. This is in my case. The first policy commitment after the Cold War was when the United Nations, supported by the United States under the presidency of George Herbert Bush, decided to resist Iraq and Saddam Hussein in his attack upon Kuwait, which we call Desert Shield, right? Now, I'm Deputy Prime Minister at this stage. I get called by Bob Hawke into a meeting, and Bob says, Bob, he never quite finished the sentence, Bob. He said, the President's going to call and wants to know what our position's going to be. And so I said, Bob, what about your mate Mulroney in Canada? You're telling me what a good fellow he is. And what about John Major in Britain? I said, they're members of NATO. What are they doing? Why would we be the first to put our hand up? And Bob said, it wouldn't be good if we So I sat through this meeting. I said, listen, Bob, I control the right of the party, more or less, in those days, right? I wasn't just Deputy Prime Minister. I said, Bob, look, if this is the first action by the United Nations in a post-Cold War world and the US wants to support that commitment, I'm for doing it. But I said, if your mates Mulroney and what's your name? Major are dragging the chain, let's get in early. I'll put my hand up for this. Let's get in early, but at a low price. I said, for getting in early, we have a low price. So I said, we've got a tanker at the Gulf and we can put a destroyer up the top of the Gulf. And he said, Bob said, okay. I said, but Bob, no combat troops, no aircraft. He said, no, that's okay. He pressed the button and the waiter came in and we all had a cup of tea and the sort of decision was taken. How much thanks have I got for the United States from that? Zero. Zero thanks, Then when I saw you mentioned putting George Herbert Bush together, the APEC leaders meeting together, the US was a Eurocentric show. It had no US policy, no Asia policy, no Pacific policy. It was always run by the Navy. Pacific policy would run out of Honolulu. There was no State Department. I come along, I'm the sort of Australian Prime Minister, so what about the Pacific? So I take on, with George Herbert's agreement, that I talk to, he says, if we do it, it'll blow up with us. Paul, you do it. So I took the Japanese Prime Minister, President Suharto, the leader of the non-aligned movement. I took the Prime Minister of Thailand, the Prime Minister of Singapore, the Prime Minister of Canada, etc. And over a period of time, I put together a consensus for the APEC leaders meeting. Right? George Herbert Bush loses the election and Bill Clinton gets the thing. I then offer to Bill Clinton the arrangements that I'd already formally put together. And he said to me, well, look, I won the election against George Bush saying it's the economy stupid and that I didn't want to be in foreign affairs escapades like Kuwait. And so what you're asking me to do is to go into essentially a strategic body. I said, that's what I am asking you. He said, I tell you what I'll do, I'll be in it if you make it look like a trade body.
Right.
So he said, and he and I then argy-bargy that, and we decided to meet in Seattle, which is the home of Boeing and Microsoft, to look like jobs across the Pacific. But you and I know, when the American president sits down with the Prime Minister, with the President of China, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of Indonesia, at leadership level, it is of course a strategic meeting, right? This came out of Australian foreign policy. This was my gift, personal gift to the United States, for which Mike Greens will give you no thanks, no gratitude, right? So that's why I don't take any notice of them,
Are you surprised by the sensitivity on the American side to this kind of criticism?
They want dummies as sort of interlocutors, They don't, as allies. thinking allies let us do the thinking, they say. Well, we've let them do the thinking, and the thinking is not very good. This is the point.
We'll come back to that question because there's a lot of sort of more recent developments on the question of the alliance and interchangeability of Australian and US forces that I think are worth picking up there. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you a question about the Quad and about the great hopes that have been invested in the Quad over recent years. It's of course been elevated to a leaders meeting now and has met more regularly in recent years. Now, one of the issues here, of course, is that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've had a number of apologias delivered for India's position on that. Now, those apologias, to be fair, were given before India's President Modi gave Vladimir Putin a kind of a public clip over the ear recently, mind you, at the same time as Indian troops.
But not a strategic clip over the ear.
Public rebuke, yeah. But this, of course, is at the same time that India is still sending troops to military exercises with Chinese and Russian forces in Vostok, right? Yeah. Now, I guess one of the more prominent Quad advocates here from the ANU is Rory Medcalf. Yeah. He said at the outset of the Ukrainian crisis that India was taking, quote, a cold, interest-based approach to the plight of Ukraine, but in the long term, its future lay with the West. And he said that the success of the Quad and other friends of India in persuading India to change that approach is not going to come through some valiant appeal to values. He said it's going to come through helping India change its national interest calculations. So what do you think of that idea that others can basically change the national interest calculation of India?
Well, this is just amateur hour nonsense. Look, the Quad is a piece of strategic nonsense. India isn't. India is important to Australia as a key state in South Asia and the dominator, if you like, of the Indian Ocean. We should be approaching India on that basis, not in some sort of, string of pearl idea that we can contain China, which basically is the idea of the late Prime Minister Abe, that we can string together US, Australia, to sort of resist China with India. I mean, could you imagine a flotilla of Indian naval vessels entering the Straits of Malacca and exiting into the South China Sea to fight the Chinese for Western values, US or Australian values? I mean, we'll never see this ever. Not a chance. I mean, I think, look, I should say this to you. Henry Kissinger and I served for years together on China, the board of China Development Bank, and we'd mostly have a dinner later, And in one of these dinners at the hotel, Henry said to me, Paul, he said that deep voice of his, you and I share a very important strategic idea that few share. And he said, but it's the big news, the big Brzezinski shares, the three of us share. And I said, what's that, Henry? He said, that India will never be part of the East Asian system. I've always believed that, you see. And I think that if China stays away from India in the Indian Ocean, you won't see any Indian naval activity or military activity in the South China Sea. In other words, the idea that the Americans and we, or the likes of Morrison, could string together some sort of defence structure around it is a piece of high nonsense. Now, let me just say about you mentioned Rory Metcalf. I got the quote from the Australian. I found this in the Australian. I assume it's the same quote, isn't it? Yeah. He says this: India, in its long-term interest, lay with the West. I mean, do you think there's one Indian politician who thinks its interest lay with the West? Its interest lay with Pakistan in the Middle East, and to some extent, notwithstanding the great wall of the Himalayas, with what the Chinese are up to. But no, he says its interest lay in the West. The success of the Quad and other friends of India in persuading India to change that approach is not going to, as you said, come through a pearl of values. It's going to come through helping India to change its national interest calculations. In other words, here we are in Australia with a so-called academic telling how we can change India's, it's how pathetic it is, change India's national interest concern. Now, this fellow Metcalf, you know, he's got this he's got a little sort of bottle of Indo oil. He's like snake oil at a sort of rural fair, you know. It works for everything. You have a sip of the Indo oil and it does everything, right? This is it. I mean, and he gets column inches in the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age and Financial Review. You know, I mean, the problem about the immaturity of the Australian international debate is that people as ordinary as Metcalf who fails to understand basic things should not be supported by editorial managers in any of the newspapers, you know, but we're going to put up with these sort of fools regularly, you know.
Can I come back to the question of the alliance, but with the United States, but more particularly on the question of sovereignty? And again, this is something that some former American officials and others have said that they're quite surprised by how sensitive Australia is about its sovereignty.
Yeah.
But how does that all stack up with the agreement that we signed with the United States and Britain, which is known as AUKUS?
Yeah.
How does it stack up with the increasing not only interoperability of United States and Australian forces, but as Defence Minister Richard Marles now calls it, the interchangeability of those forces? Yeah. Now, what does all this mean for our freedom of movement? I mean, have we had a sufficient debate in this country about those issues?
This is all done secretly by that genius Morrison, you know, with the Americans. I mean, talking about legging him over, God, they must have just said, what a coup. And you know, Americans have been boasting, oh, we've now got Australia off the fence for 40 years, this sort of thing. Look, the cabinet I belonged to built the Collins-class submarine. If I had have succeeded in winning the sixth pole, I won the fifth, I would have built another 6 Collins-class boats. So boat number 12 would have ended up being, the following one would have been boat number 1 of the next 12. If I mean, we would have had a permanent. The Collins-class boat was a completely successful boat. You know, it could not be heard under the water. You know, in exercises with the Americans, we were sinking American boats every time. I don't know whether people know that, but that's the truth of it, right? The Collins got a bad name because it had the wrong diesel engine, but that wasn't the design of the submarine. So Australia had the capacity to field its own submarine. And what was the submarines for? They were for sea denial. They were the defence of Australia. They were not designed to be picking off Chinese nuclear submarines on the continental shelf, the shallow continental shelf off the Chinese coast, which is what these Los Angeles class boats are designed to be. The US Los Angeles class boats are hunter-killers. And the Chinese, to give themselves, if you like, a nuclear response capability by submarines, if a submarine's carrying 12 or 16 missiles, it's a big boat. And if it's a big boat going across shallow waters off the continental shelf of China, it can be identified and destroyed, right? So we're shifting when the genius Morrison decided that we should be in this, and this is, I'm sure, egged on, I'm told this reliably, but I'm not certain of this, by Andrew Shearer, who's serving in the current Labor government. I hope they're not listening to him, you know. He's the one who sunk the French boats for these, I understand, reliably told, we've moved away from the capacity to defend our island continent with a class of boats which are competent at it, that didn't need to have standby capabilities a long way away, as any submarine would have off the coast of China. And so when we signed up to the AUKUS, what we've done is sign up to a hunter-killer submarine, which has got one purpose in the main, and that is to sink Chinese submarines. That's the main thing. So we're party to that now, when we shouldn't be party to it all.
I think you said at one point that their use would be basically like sheepdogs to keep the Chinese on the continental shelf
before they get in the Mariana Trench.
Yep.
Before they get in the Mariana Trench. So basically, I think we should walk away from the US nuclear submarine proposition. The British, of course, are just a joke. I mean, going to Cornwall to find our security in Asia, I mean, that's where James Cook and Arthur Phillip left 230 years earlier. I mean, do we really need to go back there? I mean, but we had Morrison, the super thinker, taking us there. What was the rest of it?
Well, I just also come back, the flip side of the...
Well, let me say the point. Yeah. I think we should walk away from the AUKUS agreement. We should build the submarines ourselves, a son of Collins or a daughter of Collins.
Yep.
Or, as Hugh White pointed out in a recent article he wrote, that the cost of the submarines, 8 of them, you could buy 25 submarines off the shelf or 24 off the shelf of, say, the German or Dutch or Norwegian, Spanish submarines, In other words, what would you rather have? Given the fact that most of them, you can only have about a quarter of them at sea, what would you rather have? 24 submarines with 6 at sea, or 8 submarines with 2 at sea, and because they're nuclear submarines, they cannot be fielded without the support of the United States. If there's interoperability, it means our sovereignty is just simply swept. Our freedom of movement and sovereignty is simply swept away, and no self-respecting Australian should ever put up their hand for our sovereignty being subjugated in this way.
The Labor opposition at the time that Morrison made this deal was given, I think, less than 24 hours notice. They were given very little time to consider the deal and its implications. Do you think their heart's really in it?
Well, the deal was supposed to provide 20 months of consideration. I think what the Labor Party in opposition should have said, well, thank you. Thank you for the briefing. We'll think about it. We've got 20 months to think about it. We'll think about it. Right? So they went for it. Now, that morning, I heard about it early, and I put a statement out saying I was opposed to it, that I thought it would subjugate our sovereignty. So the Labor Party could have taken notice of me on this point, took no notice. I had no conversation with anybody, and of course they signed up. It doesn't mean to say they have to stay signed up, though.
No.
Developing... in my first speech in the House of Representatives in 1969, I talked about the fact that at the beginning of the Second World War, we were left with no military-industrial complex in Australia, and that we should develop it. I fundamentally supported the building of the Collins-class submarines and the Anzac frigates with Transfield in Melbourne, And as I said, I would have done a second lot of self, so I would have had 12 of these. I mean, it'll be a tragedy for Australia if we keep to the AUKUS agreement. You can have the AUKUS exchange of information, that's fine. We've been exchanging information with the POMs and with the Americans forever, but we ought to walk away from the Los Angeles class submarine.
Is the national security debate, though, I mean, do you think the current government would be concerned about being politically wedged on this by opposition leader Dutton? I mean, would this be a real concern for Labor as being seen as weak on if they walk away from AUKUS, they'll be seen as weak on the alliance, untrustworthy. It'll be a repeat of those nightmares from the Cold War.
Yeah, but that's because governments in office should make their own stories. The stories that Bob Hawke, myself, Gareth Evans, the stories we made about our independence in Asia, our ability to do all these things. Kevin Rudd later with the East Asia Summit, Kevin's East Asia Summit, me with the APEC leaders meeting, Gareth with a great lot of regional foreign relations, like for instance with Ali Alatas in Indonesia, my relationship with Suharto, my relationship with the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, two Prime Ministers of Japan. I mean, we could do our thing. We could tell our story. We don't have to be caught in the Liberal Party's dumb story. And it is a dumb story.
Look, on the question of stories, actually, that provides a nice introduction to where I wanted to go now, and that is the question of national identity. Now, going back to the period of government where you were Prime Minister, there is a lot going on in that period about questions of identity, right? And Australia's national self-confidence and its regional outlook. And, you know, you said in a speech in early 1992 that in that decade Australia could be independent in ways that it had never been.
Sure.
And, of course, there'd been some changes under Whitlam and Fraser to various trappings. You know, the old relics of colonialism had kind of been sort of modified and some of them had been tossed out. But it was your feeling that still we were lacking that sense of, I think, almost psychological release from that old imperial era, right?
Indeed.
And that, you know, all of these issues that you're putting forward at the time are integrated in a way that is unlike any previous prime ministership, whether it be native title, whether it be the question of moving towards an Australian republic, whether it be the APEC leaders meeting, and so forth. And you've mentioned the treaty that you signed with Indonesia. Now, just given the recent events that we've seen in terms of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, I did just want to get your views on where the Republic debate is headed. And of course, you would recall that when you were Prime Minister, you had a 73% approval rating just on that question of whether the Australian people wanted to move towards being a republic. And you offered the Liberal Party a stake in this, you know. You'd made it clear that you would maintain the Senate's role. The Senate would still be able to block supply. You know, the powers of the Governor-General would not be circumscribed. You weren't proposing that. Howard walked away from it, put a modality in the question that he knew would defeat it.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
You've got the history right. Look, the thing is that I believe that if we were to, in the post-Cold War world, take our place appropriately in East Asia, you know, I've always taken the view we find our security in Asia, not from Asia, by holding hands with great powers. We find our security in Asia. Then you can hardly lift your head and say, by the way, our head of state is the Queen of Great Britain, is the monarch of Great Britain, you know. And I took this issue on at an election. This was in the policy speech of 1993. You know, I had people in the Labor Party with horrors thinking I would put this at an election. You know, people say, oh, well, of course, Keating had views about the Republic. Keating didn't have views about the Republic. He put a proposal at an election. And the proposal was that we would have a plebiscite around the question, do you think Australia should become a republic? Of which we had 73% support. Because the Prime Minister, me, I was out there arguing the importance of the Republic, which I always said would say more to us about ourselves than it would ever say to anybody else. But I thought in the post-Cold War world, particularly in the new relationship that I had personally invested with President Suharto in Indonesia, particularly, and all the other leaders that I was in touch with weekly in terms of developing that APEC leaders meeting and operating it, that turning up with the Queen of Great Britain, because I've got enormous respect for the Queen herself, but I'm talking about with the monarchy of Great Britain, was a joke for us, you know. At the same time, we didn't own up to the things we'd done to the Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islanders. You know, we're sort of, you know, after there was, apart from the Northern Territory Land Rights Act under the Whitlam and Fraser governments, there was really nothing that the Aboriginal Affairs power was used in any substantial way. I saw the High Court decision in Mabo as a real opportunity to settle in some way the question of land rights, without which, and own up to what we'd done. So I made the reference speech and owning up. I said, we brought the alcohol, the diseases, you know, we did the murders, we took the children from their mothers. And at the same time, even though we've wiped out native title in Melbourne, Sydney and all the metropolitan areas, still large parts, the tracts of Australia were open to a claim under the Native Title Act, which I spent 8 months of 1993 putting into place, you know, in the Parliament. So in other words, I wanted to turn over a new leaf for Australia. In other words, we had an Australian as our head of state, that we'd fessed up about what we'd done to the original inhabitants of the country. We tried to make reparations in terms of land with native title, and use this as a sort of a leitmotif of our goodwill towards the country, its original inhabitants, and the region, and the inhabitants of the region. This is what I thought was important. Now, you know, John Howard's done the country a dreadful disservice in this, because, as you correctly say, I spoke to him on the telephone about all this, by the way, at the time. I wanted to make that change where the powers of the Governor-General would not be circumscribed or written down, where the Senate could still refuse supply. In other words, it was a model the Liberal Party could have just adopted. But Howard, being, you know, always driving in the rear view mirror, always driving backwards and at speed, you know, wanted to keep the monarchy. So he put the question of not, do you want to be an Australian Republic, but rather, do you think Australia should be an Australian Republic, but rather, do you think we should have with a president appointed by the Parliament? And he knew that would fail, and then the Prime Minister didn't even argue that case, Howard as Prime Minister, and of course the thing failed. So where are we now? Where are we now? Well, Queen Elizabeth II has died. You know, I met her and told her that I would not involve her family in any of this. I had a great relationship with her, really. I mean, I think the royal family would have been so glad for the referendum passed, to be honest, you know.
This was at Balmoral in 1993.
Yeah, 1993, yeah. But now, could you say, oh, well, you know, we were too... Look at the French. The French had a revolution for their republic. The Americans have a revolution for their republic. We couldn't even pinch ours off Queen Elizabeth II, who didn't want it. You know, we couldn't take the title, even if the monarch was happy to give it. You know, and in fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised if King Charles III, the King of Australia, doesn't volunteer to give us to renounce his claim on Australia, right? So in other words, so the Republican movement say to me, oh, you should be up there now speaking for this. Why would you? I mean, you know, we fluffed it, you know, we fluffed it, you know. So if Australians have so little pride in themselves, so little pride, that they're happy to be represented by the monarch of Great Britain, why would somebody like me want to shift their miserable view of themselves, you know?
So Australians have failed to seize the Republic. They've failed to claim it as an example of their sovereignty.
Well, not all Australians, because the thing was close run and properly argued by the then Prime Minister would have succeeded. So the best instincts of Australia were visible in that campaign and in those results. But of course, you know, you've got people now, I mean, who in their right mind could believe that the monarch of Great Britain could represent our aspirations here? Whether we are multicultural or not, and we are multicultural, but just in the region, you know, we occupy one of the oldest land masses, the oldest continent on Earth, with the first, one of the perhaps the oldest society on Earth. But we think, I mean, how, you know, I mean, it's so pathetic that it barely doesn't need an argument, you know, that we have the monarch of Great Britain, and there's, you know, Morrison running off to Cornwall with that other fruitcake, what's his name? Boris Johnson.
Charles III as King of Australia doesn't exactly grab you.
No, Charles III, King of Australia, is a constitutional aberration. That's what it is.
Can I just ask a final question to perhaps tie this all together? In an interview when you first became Prime Minister, you said, and I quote, "In the Prime Ministership is vested the ideal of the nation and its aspirations." What's the ideal now for this place, Australia, to strive towards, in your view, and where are the aspirations for this country?
I think Australia has a very poor idea of itself now. Its head of state is a monarch of another country. strategic sovereignty's been outsourced to another state, a North Atlantic state, the United States. It doesn't know what it is or what it should be. You know, it doesn't know what it is and what it should be. Yet the inheritance, the gift of the continent is such a great gift, you know. I mean, look at these issues we have with China. China's 13 flying hours from Sydney. 13 flying hours. You know, here we are, we're manufacturing a problem for ourselves, you know. And, you know, and I'll just say that, you know, the problem we have in tying ourselves to the United States in Asia so uncritically is the United States has no idea what to do with itself in Asia. None. It has no coherent plan about what it wants to do and what can it do. Have a look what's happened as indications of this. We had President Obama talking about the pivot. Nothing happened. He made the big speech in Tokyo about the Senkaku Islands, about how they would regard that as Senkaku as part of Japan and came under the articles in the agreement. What do we think about that? You know, China now has a big navy. You know, if we want to be hanging around behind the Americans, what is their policy? What is their strategy in Asia? You know?
Well, we've seen President Biden now virtually unpick strategic ambiguity on no less than 4 occasions. It seems to be walked back every time. Can you see any instance in which an Australian government of either political persuasion would say no to America if there was, in fact, a conflict over Taiwan?
If I was Prime Minister, I'd certainly say no. You know, I've said, Taiwan, I repeat, is not a vital Australian interest. We should be no more interested in the political system of Taiwan than the political system of Vietnam or Kazakhstan. Why should we be interested in the political? I mean, look, remember this. Taiwan's democracy started in 1996, not 1906, 1996, when Lee Teng-hui decided, oh, look, what we should have is a bunch of municipal... We can't have the Kuomintang, the KMT, as a sole party forever. Let's have some multi-parties so we have a bunch of municipal elections to see who runs the place. And for that municipal election, we have World War III. Is that the proposition? For Taiwan's municipal election, we have World War III. You know, I mean, the Americans, if I've got any advice for them, is to stick to strategic ambiguity like glue. Because taking on, and of course the other thing about, you see, Normandy was possible because 21 miles from Normandy was an industrial state, Britain. There was no radar, there were no satellites, you know, and under the cover of bad weather, we were able to make the landings at Omaha Beach and at Normandy. There's no Western state within 21 miles of Taiwan. In fact, China's 90 miles from Taiwan. So China would see every amphibious vessel coming from the United States, whether it's Guam or whether it's San Diego or whether it's Honolulu, they'd see them and they would sink them. You know, so the chances of the Americans having a victory over Taiwan is nil, in my opinion. And why would we want to be part of that defeat? You know, why would we? And of course, if in the end, finally, the Americans walk away from East Asia, you know, we're left behind. I said to somebody recently, we can't put an outboard motor on Australia at Broome and start the motor and sort of move the continent off to San Diego. We're stuck here as the Americans take off back to their continent across the other side of the Pacific. We live in a Chinese world. That's the truth of it.
Is this part of the problem that we've mortgaged ourselves so closely to US policy that if there was, for example, a sudden change in US policy, and we've seen this happen before, however unlikely it may seem in the current circumstances and with the kind of consensus in Washington, that Australia could be left like a shag on a rock?
Yeah. If the Americans decide, if, for instance, it came to a fight over Taiwan, a fight they lost, their guarantees to Japan and Korea would fall down and then possibly the US would just simply walk away. The thing is, we can't walk away. We're stuck here, you know. And that's why it's just so unintelligent to be running this sort of a policy. When we showed in the 80s and 90s we could run a very intelligent policy with China, but with the region, with Indonesia. I mean, our bread is buttered in the Indonesian archipelago. You know, it's Southeast Asia that matters to us. This is a point I made on a television interview. I said, if you look at I gave the seesaw analogy, the park seesaw. If you regard west and east of movements in the seesaw as problems, let's say in the east with Japan and China, in the west with India and Pakistan, but at the centre, at the central focal point, the fulcrum point, that's Indonesia and Southeast Asia, we don't have these risks, right? So, I mean, we should be concentrating ideally I'd see us as a member of ASEAN, you know, and in the agreement I had with President Suharto, with ANZUS words, in what is effectively the agreement of maintaining security, which John Howard lost because of his celebration of General Cosgrove.
Yeah.
When he brought Cosgrove back with these ticker-tape celebrations in Melbourne and Sydney, President Habibie of Indonesia said, oh, you know, you were representing a UN mission and you look as though you're conducting yourself as though you are some sort of victorious invading force, so I'm suspending the agreement that Keating made with Suharto. Well, the agreement was essentially, if there was an attack on Indonesia, we would regard that as an attack on us. An attack on us would be regarded in Indonesia as more or less an attack on them. And that would mean we had more or less a mutual defence pact. This required conversation, of course, but a mutual defence pact. And as a Labor Prime Minister, I put together an ANZUS worded defence pact with the largest Muslim state in the world, the leader of the non-aligned movement. Could you imagine anyone in the Liberal Party doing such a thing? Could you imagine any one of them?
Well, I think you said it was like a steel ring fence across the top of the country.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, so our bread is still buttered in that archipelago. And imagine if we'd have spent the last 20-odd years working in cooperation under that agreement with Indonesia instead of wasting our time on this nonsense like the Quad and, American hopefulness about China. You know, isn't it a pity they're not going to be a sort of Jeffersonian liberals? You know.
So the new government, just to tie this up, the new government has started to sort of change its tone. It's talked about stabilising the relationship with China. It's it's poured out the vocabulary of the Morrison government, whether it be drums of war or so forth. It's talking about a First Nations foreign policy. It's enunciating its commitment to ASEAN centrality. Does this give you a bit more optimism about where...
Only this. Tone has got to become substance. You know, tone is one thing, substance is another, you know. And I wish the government well in this, and time will tell. At least it's not the appalling policy which was conducted by Scott Morrison.
听完基廷这场火力全开的炮轰，我们再来回顾一下他到底指出了澳大利亚身上哪些深入骨髓的病根。他向我们展示了一幅令人不安的病例。首先，他戳穿了澳美同盟的神话。他用亲身经历告诉我们，美国想要的不是一个会独立思考的盟友，而是一个不多话的马屁精。你为他拔得头筹，他连一句谢谢都欠奉。这段关系的本质从来都不是平等的伙伴关系。其次，他揭示了澳洲高层在战略上的惊人无脑。无论是天真的幻想印度会为了西方价值观去南海对抗中国，还是为了 AUKUS 潜艇协议自废武功，放弃了几十年积累下来的国防工业能力，都体现了一种彻头彻尾的战略幼稚病。再者，他痛斥了澳大利亚至今仍在精神上认祖归宗的可悲状态。他直言，一个独立了这么久的国家，国家元首居然还是英国君主，国防大事还要跑回英国去签约，这简直可悲至极，在亚洲人面前根本抬不起头。这是一种深刻的民族自卑感。 最后，他毫不留情地撕下了 AUKUS 这份协议的画皮。在他看来，这份协议根本不是为了保卫澳大利亚，而是为了把澳大利亚绑上美国的战车，去中国近海当猎杀者。他警告说，这份协议让澳大利亚的主权被彻底扫地出门，任何有自尊的国民都不应赞成。基廷的这些话听着刺耳，但他提出了一个根本性的问题，不仅是给澳大利亚，也是给所有美国的盟友。当一个国家将自己的命运完全交到一个越来越不可靠，也越来越自私的老大哥手里时，他得到的到底是安全，还是一张通往灾难的单程票？如果你认为这期节目对你有价值，请点赞、评论、分享、订阅我们的频道。感谢你的观看。